Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final research presentation session of ANH 2022. My name is Elena Martinez, and I'm the technical manager for this session entitled Transforming Food Systems for Health and Sustainability. This session will be chaired by Professor Anna Larty of the University of Ghana. I want to thank you very much for taking part in ANH 2022. We look forward to an interesting and interactive session today. So thank you so much, and over to Professor Larty to start the session.
Yes, thank you, Elena. My name is Anna Larty, and our theme is on transforming food systems for health and sustainability. You would probably be asking, why all this fuss about food systems? Everybody is talking about food systems and the need to transform it. If you recall, last year in September, the UN held a whole summit focused on food systems transformation. In fact, it has been indicated that we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we do not transform our food systems. So what is wrong with our food systems? Well, our food systems are not delivering the diets to keep us healthy. So it's not delivering healthy diets. Our food systems are also creating conditions that are not supporting the health of the planet. So it's not sustainable. You all recall on COVID-19, it actually showed how sick our food systems are. It almost crumbled under COVID-19. Our food systems are therefore not resilient. So they say we must fix our food systems to make them healthy for humans, healthy for the planet, and also more resilient should we be hit by any of these crises and shocks. Today, we are privileged to have 6 excellent presentations that will look at various aspects of food systems transformation. Each speaker will have about 8 minutes to speak, and I'll prompt them when the time is getting close. We will take the first 3 presentations, give ourselves a short break in terms of take some burning questions, and then take the next 3 presentations. So on this note, and without wasting my time, I'd like to invite our first speaker, who is Vetika Singh from the International Food Policy Research Institute in India, and she will talk to us about the role of food systems in achieving India's sustainability targets, analysis using integrated assessment model for India. So Vetika, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Larty. You have in your introduction very well laid out the motivation and background for the study that I'm going to actually talk about. So that is actually very helpful for me. So as has been mentioned, I'm Vetika Singh. I am also a PhD candidate at Humboldt University in Berlin, as well as I am employed with Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and International Food Policy Research Institute. And the paper that I'm going to present to you is an assessment of India's ability to meet its sustainability targets in line of the food and land use systems. And I'm going to specifically talk about the food systems in this paper, as that is the area that I have worked on. I will not delve too much in the motivation since it has already been mentioned by Professor Larty. The fact that we have to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, there needs to be a fine balance between food demand that is also projected to increase in light of increasing population pressures, more so in the developing countries, but also keeping environmental impacts within limitation, given that there has been research citing the impact of food demand and dietary transitions on environmental indicators. For India's specific case, it has been observed that greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, have actually doubled in the decade from 97, in the 2 decades from 97 to 2017, and they continue to increase thereafter, more so from the agricultural, food, and land use sectors. A major share of carbon emissions in India come from cereal crop production, specifically rice, as well as livestock production, to both meet India's food demand as well as for exports. This becomes all the more important in line of the COVID-19 pandemic, given that food systems vulnerability have been observed amongst all the countries, more so in developing countries such as India, Sri Lanka, and Russia-Ukraine conflict is also kind of pulling apart the threads of our existing food systems. So what is the best way to tackle these is to look at them in an integrated manner, because it has been observed that there is a circular relationship between agriculture, land use, food demand, as well as the environment. Implications in one sector often affect the other sector. Climate change has been proven to show impacts on agriculture, on our ability to produce the food locally. Our food demand also has implications on climate change. So they are all interrelated, and which is why we choose to do an analysis for India using an integrated assessment model. This is a partial equilibrium model called Model for Agricultural Production and its impact on the environment. The objective function of the model is to actually minimize the cost of production, keeping into account several socioeconomic and biophysical indicators. I do not go into the detail of the model here, but if anyone is interested, the model kind of looks at the agriculture sector as a whole and the varying relationships between food demand, which is actually one of the drivers in the model: population growth, GDP, climate change. These are all exogenous forces in the model that enable it to undertake optimization algorithms and allow us to evaluate the impacts on key indicators such as greenhouse gas emissions, food security, water use, and food self-sufficiency of any country. So this model is actually developed globally, but for the purposes of this analysis and our paper, we looked at only for India. To look at the possibilities of different scenarios and pathways, we actually created 3 alternative scenarios, which you see in the large blue boxes here. Towards the extreme left is current trends SSP2, which is essentially a business as usual scenario, which we can say is that, if nothing being done, ceteris paribus, everything will go consistently. What are the impacts on food demand, on climate, environmental indicators that we will observe? And we look at a shorter time horizon, given simulation models run up until all the way to the end of the century. But for this purpose, we are only looking at until the end of 2050. The basic assumptions between these scenarios is that if you look at the top box, population, GDP, food demand, food loss, these are all exogenous drivers that we feed into the model, and we say that these are the population trajectories that are expected to form until 2050, and these are prepared in keeping demographic transitions in mind. So how age, sex, pregnancy, lactation, all of these factors are accounted for in the model when making projections for the future. Alongside, several biophysical indicators are also used, such as the Bond Challenge, which is essentially India's afforestation target, where we promise to conserve biodiversity and to increase afforestation to 21 million hectares for India. We also look at a lot of other policy indicators, such as interest rates, cost of technology increase, liberalization, trade liberalization, secondary and livestock product consumption, and bioenergy demand as well in the current trends. The second scenario, alternative scenario that we look at is a current trend plus Eat Lancet diets, because we want to specifically look at the impact of moving towards healthy diets, which have been claimed to be both human and planet healthy. So we only use that, and the difference between these two scenarios allows us to evaluate the effect of only switching to healthy diets in the meanwhile. And then the final ambitious scenario that we look at is the sustainable pathways, in which there are improvements on all the indicators. So population growth is not that high. GDP is quite high. So per capita incomes are actually higher than the current trends. We also implement a lot of environmental policies, such as we restrict excessive use of water for agricultural production. We charge carbon taxes so that any decision making the model has on emissions are also accounted for. and also eat Lancet diets are a component of this third scenario as well. So this is like what India's sustainable trajectory would look like for all the important indicators. I will quickly delve into results now, and this is the first set of results that we present around food consumption. So overall, between the scenarios, we find that India is able to meet a very simplistic food security target of 2000 kilocalories per capita per day across food groups. And this target allows us to look at the varying constitution of food groups. So although in all scenarios, we have produced 3 timelines here, 2010, 2030, and 2050, we are able to see that by 2050, almost all scenarios except for the current trends, which kind of there's a little shortfall there, but we're able to meet. But the food group consumption varies. So in the current situation in India, if business as usual scenario is to be followed, we already see that about 79% of our current diets comprise of cereals, sugars, oil, and animal products. Animal products are minuscule, but cereal, sugars, and oils are a lot. Dairy as well is quite a lot as compared to other countries. But if we were to switch to Eat Lancet diets, which we observe in our current plus eat scenario, we observe a sharp increase in pulses, fruits and vegetables, nuts and oils. Ruminant meat is a very small share in India, so there's not much change as well. The one interesting observation here is that protein intake doubles in the Eat Lancet scenario as compared to the business as usual scenario. So that is a good indicator for us. However, we have implications on the food price index. So if we were to switch to a sustainable path, which is the green line here, we observed that although in 2030, there is not much change as compared to the baseline, by 2050, there is slight increase in the food price index overall because of a lot of other indicators. In our analyses, we're also able to look at greenhouse gas emissions and implications on land use, water, and self-sufficiency. But we observe in overall conclusions that if we were to switch to sustainable pathways, increased yields actually help us meet food demand, and that is possible for India. There are synergies with agricultural cropland and GHG emissions to meet food demand. However, the downside is that there is a greater reliance on imports overall and higher food prices. However, it is actually possible to address the complex challenges within the environmental and the agricultural sector. So I should end here as I'm a little bit above time, but happy to answer any questions in the meanwhile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vatika, for taking us through this very interesting presentation regarding sustainability. I'm sure that people will have questions to ask you, especially in relation to the diets and the Indian situation. Now we will go on to the second presenter, and our second presenter is going to be Paula Lunardelli from the University of Westminster, UK, and she's going to talk to us on addressing antibiotic use in plant agriculture, a review of national action plans on antimicrobial resistance in India, China, and Indonesia. So Paula, please take the floor.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me here. And I'm Paula Lunardelli, and Regina Keefe and Winston Tam were my supervisors that support me and guide me in this project. Actually, antibiotics in plant agriculture have been used since the 50s in US, mainly for palm and citrus trees and ornamental plants. Nowadays, actually the amount and types of antibiotics used in plant agriculture and possible interactions with pesticides are unclear due to a lack of regulation and surveillance systems worldwide. According to WHO and FAO, only 3% of the countries reporting having a regulation system, while this practice is expected to increase. And also, it's known that antimicrobial resistance can represent a concern in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the problem relations to food systems and impact on public health, first, trade, where antimicrobial resistant genes on crops can be imported from countries with weak or no regulations. And therefore, these genes being transferred to consumers and the gut transformed in a potential reservoir for due to the interaction interrelation between microbial communities. Also, global action plan on antimicrobial resistance were adopted in 2015 by the World Health Assembly, and countries were invited to develop their own national action plans. So in 2018, FAO developed the integrated pest management with more precise guidelines to help countries to address plant health. So in 2021, 163 countries have a reporting having their NAPs, including China, India, and Indonesia. So China developed in 2016, India and Indonesia in 2017. The rationale for these countries is based on rice production, as rice is the crop on which antibiotics are most recommended by agricultural advisors in low and middle income countries. And these countries are the top 3 producers. So the research was conducted in 2 different approaches. First, the policy content analysis using a theoretical adaptive framework divided into policy design, implementation, and monitor and evaluation, and which was used to map the NAPs, and then an investigation of ground realities of antibiotic use in plant agriculture by reviewing governmental documents, reports, articles, and peer-reviewed literature. So the policy design, not surprisingly, the plant agriculture was overlooked, and countries prioritizing human health and livestock. Therefore, no entity had jurisdiction for governing antimicrobial resistance in plant agriculture, and no budget mentioned. However, there was some awareness of the problem. For instance, India did acknowledge the pharmaceutical industry influence in the sector. However, Indonesia, the Ministry of Environment and Forest was not even an active stakeholder. And China, the focus, the emphasis was on antibiotic research, economic development, and production. So again, some common points were for implementation, the importance of international collaboration, a national lab network, however, was a lack of protocol to address traceability systems. Regarding regulation, there was a kind of a different interpretation and lack of data. For example, in India, the classification is done by the Central Insecticide Board and Registration Committee, and this process is done by taking into account what actually the industry states in their application. So for example, streptocycline, which is a mix of streptomycin and tetracycline, was incorrectly registered as a fungicide under low toxicity category, and actually can be bought at Amazon. In China is a little bit different, because it's the Green Pest Control who decides what it's approved. And actually certain antibiotics were considered to be a type of biopesticides on the category of least toxic residual synthetic pesticides. And actually, these products are subsidized by the government and sometimes encouraged by plant doctors in plant clinics. Indonesia, although there was, let's say, importance of monitoring antimicrobial use in the food chain, there was a lack of data regarding regulation and classification. Finally, monitoring and evaluation. So again, some common points: no reporting and feedback mechanism, no assessment on risk of antibiotic misuse, and no updates after 2018, which refers to the document of FAO's document. However, India foresees a revision of the curricula for some professional groups, for example, on the agriculture sector and the food industry. Indonesia points to behavior change through education programs in her areas. And China points some surveys and interactive reporting platforms among multiple sectors, although these sectors were not specified. So discussion. The most eye-popping observations were, first, a lack of interconnectedness between agriculture, health, nutrition, and environment. Secondly, a very strong environmental contradiction, because while there was a great attention to environmental contamination, antibiotics being directly and intentionally sprayed or injected into nature was not a concern. And again, a very inconsistent nomenclature. Sometimes plant agriculture was related or to, for instance, crops, food production, environmental sector, food sample. So it was a little bit confused. So finally, some key messages. There is an urgent need for a standardized normative regulation, and especially for giving less room for different interpretation, and a potential trace and track system of for antibiotics. Robust governing institution at national and subnational level, expands farmer outreach programs, and actually farmers' voice must be taken into account in the decision-making process, because sometimes people who makes the decision are very far from the fields, and sets up realistic goals based on competences and financial resources. And finally, policy should be focused on nutrition security and the right to food. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you again for taking us to look at the situation of antimicrobial resistance and national plans of action that countries are taking. Now, let's go to the next presenter. Let's look at Megan Dini from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, UK. And she will talk to us about health effects of recycling and reusing plastic packaging in the food systems. Thank you, Megan. You can take the floor.
Thank you so much. And I'm just saying hello to everyone in the room as well. We've got a small audience here for our other presenters too. And thanks so much for joining online in this parallel session. So I'm going to be talking about plastic food and drink packaging, circular economy strategies, and global health outcomes through the results of a recent systematic review and meta-analysis. So circular economy strategies, which includes recycling and reuse, clearly support more sustainable management of natural resources and reduce the amount of waste that we generate. However, there might also be potential co-benefits for other sustainability goals, including things like reaching net zero targets, but also certain analyses have found potential trade-offs with other SDGs, as you can see here on the right-hand side. And plastic packaging, which is mainly used for food and drink, has of course become somewhat of a poster child for linear, single-use, highly resource intensive and wasteful economies of usage. And so a lot of work's being done to try to reform this system, in particular in work following a resolution for a global plastics treaty to end plastic pollution, which was passed at the United Nations Environment Assembly earlier this year. And so looking at some of the health effects that could follow a circular economy of plastic packaging, we might get benefits from it, in fact, from reducing things like incineration and open burning at the end of the life cycle, as we heard a bit about earlier today. And that's, of course, linked to air pollution and respiratory diseases. However, there might also be increased risks from circular economies, which was also highlighted earlier, from things like introducing toxic chemical contaminants during the recycling process, or, for example, hygiene concerns in reuse. And so, unfortunately, the actual data behind these health effects is incredibly scarce. So in the absence of sufficient epidemiological evidence, we conducted a systematic review of life cycle assessment studies, and these are environmental impact assessment methods, and they work really on the basis of developing an inventory of all of the resources used and all of the emissions generated by a product life cycle, for example, plastic packaging. And they then have conversion factors which allow you to estimate the environmental impacts which are listed here. And this method has now also evolved to provide conversion factors for disability adjusted life years to estimate the human health effects. And so this is what we were really looking for in these studies to conduct the meta-analysis. So we conducted a systematic search for peer-reviewed life cycle assessment studies that were focusing on primary packaging, which is that we come into contact with as consumers, drinks bottles, cups, serviceware, and grocery bags made of any type of plastic, but each study had to include some kind of linear versus circular economy comparison. So that might be looking at increasing the recycled content of plastic packaging, for example, or single-use versus reusable, or end-of-life recycling versus incineration and landfill. And we were specifying that they had to include at least one of these environmental health or disability adjusted life year estimates. So we found 49 eligible life cycle assessment studies, and we've mapped them in an interactive evidence and gap map, so I can share that with you after the session and you can have a look. But notably, almost all of these assessments came from high income countries, with just 4 from Thailand and 1 from China. And only 1 of them actually calculated the disability adjusted life years. Most of them focused predominantly on these contributing environmental health pathway indicators. But we then converted all of these to disability adjusted life years for the purpose of the meta-analysis. And in terms of recycling, what we found is a really strong evidence for a linear trend between increasing recycling rate and decreasing disability adjusted life years relative to incineration or landfill. And these results would equate roughly to a day of healthy life gained globally per tonne of plastic packaging recycled compared to incineration or landfill. However, there are critical evidence gaps that mean we have to really look at this with caution. The DALIs are mainly a result of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and so the health effects of climate change. But there were also certain benefits derived from, for example, reducing toxicity indicators, air pollution, ozone formation and depletion, and water use. However, some studies actually found increased risk as a result of these same indicators. And really, unfortunately, there weren't enough studies to really unpack why those differences occur. So we do need more life cycle assessments looking at that. In terms of reuse, what we found is that based on a purely design, if you used each one once, reusable products versus single use, you'd actually have a vast relative increase in health-related impacts. And you start to accrue the benefits, of course, after you start reusing it. We found on average across the products that we were looking at, you'd have to use it 30 times just to equal the climate change impacts of the single-use alternative. And so to sort of interpret these results, we did find evidence for possible co-benefits of circular strategies in plastic packaging. And these were relatively small in meta-analyses, but as I mentioned, the critical evidence gaps mean that we're likely underestimating the health effects in both directions currently, and lots of them are unaccounted for in this evidence. And what we really need is more life cycle assessments based on the latest data that use the full range of health effects that are possible to estimate. And of course, looking at low and middle income country settings. And the problems associated with plastics are only going to increase over coming years, in particular in low and middle income countries where plastic packaging is set to increase, or consumption of it is set to increase. And the alternatives, of course, include things that are very relevant to health, like open burning and unregulated landfill. But what I think that we have found is that life cycle assessment could be a really useful framework for public health, and we could maximise on that by developing new health conversion factors for various pathways, including from pollution to health. So I hope that that gave you an overview, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Megan, for this interesting presentation. It's quite scary, actually, when we look at the extent to which people are using plastics. But we will come to it. We can go to the next presentation. Please put your questions in the chat box, and they'll try and answer them, but we will take some also later when we've finished. So I would like at this point to go on to the next presenter. The next presenter is Carol Dallin, University College of London Institute for Sustainable Resources, London. and she's going to talk to us about what are the environmental and animal health impacts of increasing people's fruit and vegetable consumption for better nutritional health in South Africa. So, Carol, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Larty, and thanks for having me in the session. So my name is Carole Dalin, and I'm presenting today this work, which is part of a collaborative project called Chefs, Sustainable and Healthy Food Systems, and it's led by Abby Chapman, and I'm presenting in her behalf today as she's not available to present. So in this work, we look at pressures on biodiversity from food production, and in particular, the production of fruits and vegetables, which are currently under consumed. So we want to see what is the current level of pressures on biodiversity of the current consumption, in particular in South Africa in this presentation, although we also work on UK and India. And so we are looking at the effects of producing fruits and vegetables for South Africa consumption. So it's both production occurring domestically in South Africa and also the production in its trade partner from where they import fruits and vegetables. So why do we care about this question of biodiversity impact and fruits and vegetables? So as you might know, in South Africa, like in many other countries, fruits and vegetables are a food group that is under-consumed in relation to the dietary guideline for healthy and sustainable diets. So we know that the policy agenda is to increase the amount of fruits and vegetables consumed in order to reduce the burden of disease associated with this underconsumption. But also on the environmental side, we know that agricultural land use is associated with a huge portion of global biodiversity loss. And we have to, at the same time, feed the population with healthy diet, but also protect the ecosystems that the agriculture depends on. So it goes back to the resilience question that was introduced in the beginning of the session. While we need to produce food, the current systems are impacting biodiversity negatively, and that might affect future capacity to keep producing because we might lose the services of pollinators, for example. So this is why in this study, we are looking at how fruits and vegetables, which are particularly health relevant food products, we are looking at their impact on biodiversity in South Africa and in its trade partners. So a lot of research in sustainable and healthy diets area focused on carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, so basically worried about climate change. And biodiversity is relatively much less studied. So that's also something we want to address. So how do we do it? We have used, because we have to not only look at the country we are interested in terms of consumption, we need to also see how food is produced in its trade partners from which it imports food. We have to use global data sets. So we use basically two kinds of data. One, which is on the left side, related to fruits and vegetable agricultural statistics. So the production, the yield, which is the productivity per area, the harvested area in terms of where it's located. So this is from the Herstat database. And in terms of the biodiversity, which is on the right side, we have looked at birds and mammals, species richness, so here by biodiversity, we mean species richness, which is the number of species. So it's really just not looking at how many individuals are in the population, but just the number of different species that are present in the different locations. So for that, we use a global database from the Red List and BirdLife International, which are providing the range of mammal and bird species. And finally, we use the international trade data for fruits and vegetable commodities, which is based on FAO stat and corrected as in this previous paper, which is listed here. So then how do we combine those data? It's basically, we come up with this metric that we call biodiversity pressure. And it's looking at the ratio of basically how much of the grid cell is harvested with a given crop. So the interest as well is that we are doing a crop specific study. And we are looking at basically the amount of species richness that is overlapping with this crop area. And then in the denominator, we put the production of the crop. It's basically the ratio between the species richness that is potentially affected because of the occupation of land by agriculture and how much food you get out of this. So it's kind of looking at the trade-off between potentially affected biodiversity and, food provision service of agriculture. And then we are looking at this metric, which is starting at the grid cell level, and we are getting the country level data to be able to say how much biodiversity pressure is exerted by a given fruit or vegetables in each country. So this is just an average of the cell level variable. And in the end, it corresponds to basically looking at the overlap between cropland and species habitats across the country and the total production of this crop in the country. And final method slide, we then estimate the biodiversity pressure of consumption of this crop by basically combining our metric, which is BP, biodiversity pressure, and the trade data. So for imports, we are looking at the trade from all of the different countries to South Africa in this case of the given crop. And then we also have the component from local production. So basically what is produced minus what is exported times the local biodiversity pressure. So this corresponds to the pressure from the consumption of fruit and vegetables that is sourced domestically. And the purple one is from imports. So what do we find? This is a map of South Africa, so two different maps. So on the left, we show the crop for which we find in a given grid cell the highest value. So we have to zoom in because it's a really quite small area in the northeast of South Africa here. But this is the fruits for which, and among all the fruit and vegetables that we have, we found that raspberry had the highest pressure in a given cell. And that's because it's grown in a highly biodiverse area and also has a small yield. So we find that the ratio is very high. On the right-hand side, you have citrus fruits, species affected per ton of citrus produce. So you can see that it's grown much more widely in the country. And also there is quite a lot of variability depending on where this is produced. So quite a lot of heterogeneity even within one country. And the results for South Africa's consumption. So these two graphs include the pressures based on how much fruits and veg are consumed in South Africa. So it's a combination of the South African impact and the impacts in its trade partners. So we found two things here. So that fruits consumption puts more pressure on biodiversity than vegetable consumption, although we have to test this using other units than tons, such as dry matter, weight, and calories. So this is upcoming. And on the right side, we find that basically there's almost an even contribution of imported fruit and veg versus domestically produced fruit and veg in terms of biodiversity pressure. So this affects, this basically shows us that the risks are really dependent on which fruits and vegetables we are looking at. And we need to think about the dietary diversity in terms of achieving both health and environmental goals. So I'll wrap up over time. So thanks for inviting me to speak, and thanks for the audience for listening, and keep an eye out for our upcoming publication, which will include also UK and India. Thanks for, and get in touch via email or on the chat. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline, for your presentation. Very interesting. I'm sure that there will be questions for you, especially how do you balance the nutrition and the environmental aspects, because we are promoting this. Now let's go on to the next speaker, who is Kate Snyder, who is from Johns Hopkins University. She will be talking to us about the rigorous monitoring. Rigorous monitoring is necessary to guide food systems transformation in the countdown to 2030 global goals. The floor is yours, Kate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Larty. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to be talking about a new initiative called the Food Systems Countdown to 2030 initiative, which is a large partnership that has the ambition to track food systems and their performance to meet the SDGs and other global goals. I probably don't need to tell anyone here, and it's already come up in this session, that food systems play a role in meeting all 17 of the SDGs. But we don't know a whole lot from the SDG indicators themselves about how to change food system transformation. So what we really need to execute on that agenda are clear and rigorous metrics that can guide decision makers. And these have to cover all aspects of food systems and their interactions in some sort of comprehensive framework to be able to address the exact types of trade-offs that just came up in the last session. As of last year, when the UN Food Systems Summit focused global attention on food systems, there wasn't a rigorous mechanism to do this type of tracking. It's necessary for a variety of reasons. Food systems was on the policy agenda last year. To meet the SDGs, it has to stay on the policy agenda, which means we need continued delivery of evidence to guide decision makers and track progress and keep both attention and accountability focused on transforming food systems. So the Food Systems Countdown Initiative formed in 2021 to fill this gap. Its goal is to publish annual assessments to provide this actionable evidence that tracks progress and can guide decision makers to inform transformation and intervention choices. And we hope that it will complement other monitoring and tracking of related global goals, like the Global Nutrition Report at global and regional scales. It's a tripartite partnership with 3 co-chairs from GAIN, Dr. Lawrence Dodd, Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Jessica Fonzo, and from FAO, Dr. Jose Rosero Moncayo. And we have this ambitious vision all the way to 2030. So we formed in 2021 when we published a framework paper that informed our vision of food systems and exactly how you would structure such a tracking activity. And in the past year, and what I'm hoping to talk most about today, is the process we are going through to actually select the indicators that can inform this comprehensive suite of metrics that can be the evidence base needed to guide decision makers and track progress. So last year, what we did was develop an architecture. And so what you see here is the food system framework that we published, and it identifies the drivers, components, and outcomes of food systems. And we organized the tracking schema, if you will, around themes, which are sort of high-level outcomes of food systems and cross-cutting dimensions, and then domains, which are topic areas under each theme for which specific indicators are monitored. And so here you see what those themes, the top level, diets, nutrition, and health, environment, natural resources and production, livelihoods, poverty, and equity. Those are the outcomes of food system themes. And then the cross-cutting themes, governance and resilience and sustainability. So these are the ones that emerged out of the framework paper that we developed last year. And you can see here the indicator domains that have been identified under each of those. So now turning to what we have actually done this year to select the indicators, we went through an inclusive multi-stakeholder process. So it involved our own set of nearly 60 collaborators from almost 30 institutions who've been working together since last year. An additional set of, I believe, about 65 additional experts in the field, scientists working in all of the different dimensions of food systems. And then also a consultation with policy stakeholders. And so in blue, you see what the collaborators, those 60 people who've been working together since 2021 undertook, which is developing a framework, establishing criteria for indicators, and generating a candidate list of indicators that could then be scored against those criteria. And both the collaborators and the additional experts went through a survey process of scoring those candidate indicators against criteria. The experts were also invited to address and assess gaps and provide suggestions for other indicators and other data. And then we also engaged these policy stakeholders to provide feedback and especially to comment on regional priorities and the policy traction of such an initiative. And then the collaborators are now ingesting all of that information and selecting the final indicators. So to backtrack just a minute, we had some prerequisites for what could get on that candidate list. I won't go through the details of these, but you can see them here and the slides are available online. These were feasibility for the purposes of our initiative, which is tracking over the next 8 years. Coverage, again, for the purposes of our initiative, which is globally, has a global ambition. And then no black boxes, so we excluded indicators that have undisclosed methodologies or that are based on, that are composite indicators where change can't be clearly tracked or decomposed into their components because the aggregation methods have not been. Then once we assessed a set of candidates and ensured that they met those initial prerequisites, they went through the process of being scored against their relevance, quality, and interpretability. And then we had a fourth criteria of usefulness that was applied for single indicators to mean that they met the first 3 criteria. And then we're also applying that now in the final selection as a criteria that the suite of indicators in each domain are useful for policy making and for decision making. We operationalize these criteria with 2 sub-criteria in each, which are very specific. And this is what the criteria were scored, or what the candidate indicators, pardon me, were scored against. And then we held these regional policy consultations, which interacted with nearly 500 participants from the 5 FAO regions. So we took all of that and we have moved towards nearly a final set of indicators for each of these 5 domains. And I want to just show you a couple of the interesting insights that have emerged in each of these. So for the first, diets, nutrition, and health, we really found it hard to identify a parsimonious set of indicators that cover both all populations and all dietary concerns and malnutrition in all its forms. Food safety and water are very clear gaps. And we initially thought that we would consider policies affecting food environments under this domain, under this theme, but it was much clearer. It was clear from the survey and the policymakers that they really understood those to be areas of governance. And so those policies have now moved under our governance theme. So just an example of how the multi-stakeholder process really informed how we're selecting the final indicators and interpreting the results. Under environment and natural resources, one key gap is that emissions indicators track to the location of production and don't account for trade. And so that's something that really has to be addressed if we want to understand the responsibility of consumers for emissions. And pollution was also another gap that was addressed. And I think Megan's presentation just now around plastics is one great example of research that's filling that gap. We found a lot of indicators for agriculture, but few that are specific to the rest of food systems for livelihoods. In governance, we found very few indicators whatsoever, and even fewer that are specific to food systems, and face the challenge of what policies to be considered essential or sentinel for transformation. And then for resilience, there's a lot of data limitations, and for certain areas of resilience, there are big gaps. And so we found it hard to identify even a single indicator for some of these. All right, so this is my last slide. I just want to finish up around key gaps. I've mentioned some of these, but food safety, environmental impacts that go beyond production and cover all areas of the globe, income and welfare statistics that are specific to people whose livelihoods are tied to food systems governance writ large is an area where we really have a massive data and metric agenda, and then food loss and waste, we don't currently have any data at the country level. And so now we're finalizing the set of indicators. And in this year's paper, we'll be publishing our current status and time trends and a few indications of relationships between indicators and moving towards performance assessment and deeper analysis of trade-offs, synergies, and sustainability in the future. Thank you, and sorry for running over a bit there.
Okay, thank you very much again, Kate, for taking us through these food systems transformation indicators. You know, we have to be held accountable for the food systems commitments we are making. And thank you that you are putting in place something to hold everybody accountable, whether we are making progress or not. Now let's go to our next speaker, Our next speaker is going to be Tibebu Chinasho of the Wageningen University, Netherlands, and will speak to us about spatial farming systems diversity contributes to nutrient intake variability among children in rural Ethiopia. So again, the floor is yours, Tibebu.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I'm Tibebu Mogas from Ethiopian Public Health Institute and currently a PhD student at Wageningen University. And I will present you how farming systems, the different farming systems in rural Ethiopia is related to micronutrient intake. So often nutritional problems in Ethiopia are estimated and reported either at a national level or the regional level. And those approaches are, we feel that those approaches doesn't or lack contextual factors, particularly for the rural community. And we try to see those estimates from the farming's perspective. To do that, we used the data from the National Food Consumption Survey, which is collected from 228 rural clusters. And we categorized those 228 clusters into 10 dominant farming systems. And we applied the National Cancer Institute method to estimate the usual distribution for vitamin A, zinc, and iron intake. Also, we used the EAR cutoff method and full probability method to estimate the inadequacy intake of those nutrients. And finally, we put all those things into a model. It's a multi-level mixed model to see the association between the nutrient intake as well as between the association at different levels, at level 1 and the level 2, and the variability which is associated again to differences in farming systems. Here is the distribution of the different farming systems. The dots are the clusters, the 228 clusters included in the National Food Consumption Survey. So each clusters are categorized under the 10 farming systems, under the 10 dominant farming systems, and the distribution is unevenly distributed throughout the country. So we found that those are the distribution of the different cluster farming systems across Ethiopia, and they constitute the 228 rural clusters. And we found that in the cereal dominated farming systems, particularly vitamin A intake is a problem, zinc is a problem, and iron is not a problem in the cereal dominated systems. But if we look at from the agropastoral and the pastoral farming systems, iron is an issue. And usually at a national level and regional level, iron nutrition in Ethiopia is considered as adequate, but when we decompose that assumption into local context, particularly from the farming systems aspect, we found that iron is still a problem for the agropastoral and pastoral communities. And for also in the cereal dominated system, vitamin A intake is also a problem. And zinc is quite common across the different cluster systems. So by considering the individual level factors and cluster level factors, we try to model the extent of the variability that can be explained by the individual factors and cluster level factors. When I mean cluster level factors, food security at cluster level and farming systems at cluster level were considered as a level 2 or cluster level factors. And demographic informations like child age, sex, wealth index, mother's education, and food groups consumed, those factors were considered as individual level factors. And we put those two factors into our model and see how the variation is explained across the different micronutrients. And if you look at for iron, the differences in cluster level factors, particularly difference in the farming systems, can contribute or can explain more than 50% of the variation observed in the country in the rural community. And for vitamin A is about also 45% of the variability among children can be explained by differences in clusters level factors, particularly the farming systems. And the influence of cluster level factors, particularly farming systems, get lower for zinc, and individual level factors become somehow prominent in explaining the variability for the zinc. So in conclusion, the diets in rural Ethiopia is not adequate to meet the nutrient requirement for children, and understanding the local context, especially for the rural community from the farming perspective, will offer an opportunity to design an alternative interventions to address the inadequate micronutrients in the rural Ethiopia. So those are the themes included in this study, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Tibebu. So ladies and gentlemen, we have taken all 6 presentations. Very exciting. You can see some of the comments that we are receiving in the chat box. So we have some time for discussion. So I would like to open the floor for questions. I mean, these exciting presentations, certainly you have some questions to ask. So please, the floor is open. You will mute yourself and then let us know who your question is targeted to, and then they'll take it. Otherwise, I have some questions that have come in. This one is for Kate. He's asking, how do you measure usefulness for policy making? This is for Kate. And then there's another one for Megan. Let me just read the 2 and then they can both take it. The other one for Megan. In your view, have you come across any research in health risk resulting from inappropriate recycling practices? You know, I wonder what are the enforcement protocols in the recycling industry to prevent these more practices. Okay, these are the 2 questions, and I also have a few I'll ask. Okay, please, Megan, Kate, take the floor.
I guess I can go first. Usefulness for policymaking, that is a very difficult question. And certainly we don't have some gold standard validated measurement metric of what is useful for policymakers. Our process relies a lot on the role of FAO in this project. They are one of the 3 leading partners. And they took the lead in these regional policy stakeholder convenings. And so mostly what we know about what would be useful to policymakers came through from those consultations. And then there's also always the input of experts and of the collaborators, many of whom work directly with governments from within FAO and from other positions. Some of our other partners are also, we have, for example, somebody who sits in the government of Zambia, somebody else who works very closely with the government in Kenya, and a few other examples of people like that who are pretty much sitting right between the research and policy world. And so that's the best we can do. If anyone has more insights into the best way we can do that, I'd be happy to hear them.
Okay, thank you very much. And then we'll have, there's a question for Megan, I think.
Thanks so much. And I was actually replying to your comments in the chat. Winston, thank you so much for your really useful comment there just above about how the sort of growing evidence around proliferation of microplastics in our food has changed actually your dietary behavior and what foods you might choose. And I think that's such an interesting pathway that I hadn't actually considered at all. So thank you for that comment. And in terms of the inappropriate recycling evidence in our review, no, we didn't find any of that. It's a pathway that's not considered, and we didn't find any of those scenarios in life cycle assessment studies. So no, although this process is quite heavily regulated, particularly in Europe and the US, and that evidence is mainly using risk assessments, but sort of the evidence for chemical contamination is is not really based in human populations. So a really interesting pathway with very little epidemiological data, as I was saying. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Megan. But Megan, I have one question for you. From what you've presented, what will it take, to really get countries to make laws against plastic waste?
Thanks so much,
Okay.
Professor Larty. Yes, I think we've all been wondering that, but I think this resolution for a global plastics treaty is really starting in the right direction of making those laws. And I think doing it as a collective and bringing people together from different countries is absolutely the right way to do it, because it's such a global system. It's not that the plastic that we produce, consume and dispose of stays within one country. It's such a huge trade across nations. And so it's really something that we need to reflect on, particularly a lot of high income countries exporting waste to low income countries where there isn't the infrastructure to deal with this. So I have high hopes for the work that's going on towards that treaty. And I know that's taking place over the next 2 years. So fingers crossed for that.
Okay, well, let's hope so, because our world needs help. Okay, now I see some questions for Tibebu. Tibebu, can you take these 2 questions? One is, it says, I'm curious if you could account for food imports in your analysis, or what do you think its role could be in the link between farming systems, diversity, and nutrient intake variability? Can you comment on this, Tibebu?
Yeah. Sorry for the interruption. I missed a couple of slides during my presentation. So the first question is how those level 2 factors are affecting the nutrient intakes, and what kind of data have you used for your analysis? That was the first question. So from the level 2 factors, we only had cluster level food security, which is mostly given by the government by using some criteria in the farming systems. But we didn't find any relationship between those cluster level food security. Otherwise, the influence, what we have seen, is based on the difference in farming systems. And so the data source, we use the Ethiopian food consumption data, which is done in 2011. And also for imputing the nutrients, we used mostly the Ethiopian food composition table, and some estimates also borrowed from neighboring countries like Uganda. And the third question is, I'm curious if you could account food import in your analysis. Yet it would have been great, but we have no data or information on the source of food being consumed at a national level. So we assumed everything that be consumed by children is either they get from their farm or from the local markets.
Okay, thank you. We still have time for questions. Maybe whilst we wait for more questions to come in, I have a question for Tika. You were looking at the Eat Lancet diet, and in your response, you said it can actually also not only contribute to the sustainability that India wants, but also in terms of income. I know that when the Eat Lancet report came, some people actually looked at the cost and said that it's not affordable. It may be sustainable, but it's not affordable. Can you comment on this in light of the work that you have done in India?
Very well, Professor Larty, that's an excellent point. And it is indeed true for the research that has been done around the cost of healthy diets for India and several other countries as well, that for developing countries, these diets are actually not affordable, given the fact that production of healthy foods, such as fruits and vegetables, pulses, nuts, are expensive. So in our analysis, we include the cost of production, and we also include commodity prices. And in the overall optimization, the model decides that it can compromise on some things, but also try to meet food demand. And therefore, we see that we are able to make those transitions for India. But for a lot of other countries in the same model, we see that Eat Lancet transitions are actually not as cheap as you would think. So we are looking at other dietary recommendations. So for example, for India, we are looking at the recommendations by the National Institute of Nutrition now, which is going to be a supplementary, like the second paper in this series, where we look at whether those diets are also affordable or producible in the modeling framework. But it is indeed true that healthy diets are expensive, and hence in this integrated assessment modeling technique, we are trying to see where compromises or trade-offs can be made in order to still continue to produce and feed the population or ensure these dietary transitions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, any questions? Do we have any more questions? Okay, whilst we wait, I have one for Carol. Carol, we are talking about healthy diets. And your work, you are looking at the environmental impact. I mean, yes, sometimes, even some healthy diets will have some environmental impacts, even some of the fruits and vegetables. So where do we get the balance? We cannot say because it has environmental impacts, we are going to recommend people to consume less. So where's the balance? We want human health, planetary health, we need to have some balance. So exactly. where do we stand on this? Yeah, can you comment on that?
Thanks, that's a tough one. So I mean, that's exactly, you pinpoint, the challenges that we need to basically navigate trade-offs in those food systems, because sometimes we find that healthier options can actually have more environmental damages associated with their production. But actually, there also are, I think, quite a lot of synergies, not just trade-offs. And in the case of, climate change impact, for example, it's quite clear that plant-based diets have fewer impacts on the environment, but and also a better outcome for health and nutrition. Than diets which are heavy in red meat, for example. So there are some synergies. And I think it's just a matter of being a bit careful with some kind of simple messages. You have to switch to this, I'll switch to that, and it's going to be perfect for all your metrics that you can think of, environmental health, human health. So in this study with fruits and veg, we're just trying to see how to optimize this, basically. So with different constraints, we want to have enough fruits and vegetables to meet, to provide healthy diets. We want to change the food system so that it provides healthy diet. But we have to be careful about where we decide to grow more fruit and vegetable and how we decide to grow it, because it's not just banana is better than avocado. It's just how do you grow it, where do you grow it, and it's about the farming practices as well. It's a lot. There's a lot to say, but I just stop here.
Okay. But certainly we should come to a balance somewhere, so it doesn't affect our diet. Okay, good. Any more questions? I see a question again that has come up for Tibetu. You can read it on there. But whilst you are looking at it, let me just ask this question to Paula. I was kind of surprised about the fact that we have a global action plan that countries have to develop their own plan out of. And we see this diversity, in terms of how countries are implementing this. Have we missed a layer? Shouldn't we be having maybe a regional action plan? And then from there, country can build from there their kind of national action plan so that there's some kind of harmony, from global, regional, and national action plans. What do you think, Paula?
Well, exactly. Actually, this research was a bit of, if you think regarding the use of antibiotics as pesticides. And then what happened is, I was addressing, how countries were not addressing plant agriculture in the NAPs, basically, because as the guidelines were not precise, was more general, because everything was based from the global action plan, but it was not specified. Just in 2010, that, some actually precise and accurate guidelines, for countries to develop that. And we have to take into account another thing. There's a problem, geography, also financial resources, technical expertise. So I think the countries need more, let's say, more standard guidelines in order, and some technical advice, and also taking into account what, for instance, the country, what is acceptable for every country. Because at the end of the day, just people is using, in the case of Indonesia, there is a lack of data. And actually, the rice production in Indonesia is based on 90% in smallholder farmers. So how can we reach these people? So it's a very complex, but I mean, some red flags already coming from this issue. And I think this is opportunity to not to wait until this become an emergency to take action.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at the time. It looks like our time is up. So we will have to wrap up. We have heard a lot about issues within the food system, sustainability issues, issues about problems in the food system, antimicrobial use, environmental waste. We saw the plastic waste issues. We've seen a group trying to hold the world accountable with the commitments that have been made through the food systems countdown, and on and on. I think it's a very exciting era in which we are, and we are all working around the food systems. And we are hoping that by 2030, our food systems will have been transformed to what we really wanted to do for us. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our great speakers. You've really presented a lot of food for thought, open our eyes to certain important issues. And we'd like to say a big thank you to all of you. In fact, if we were in a room, I would have said everybody should clap for our speakers. You've done great. Thank you very much. And have a nice evening.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers, and thank you to Professor Larti for the excellent facilitation.